welcome back to episode 7 of our Social Isolation CRICKETher Vodcasts. We're into May now. The days are getting longer. So is Syd's hair. Where are we this week, Syd?
Oh, well, this week's a tough one. This week's probably the most difficult one we've had. So if you can guess this week, if you can guess where it is, you're doing well. If you can guess when it is as well as where, apart from the handful of us that were actually there, you're doing really well. So we might have to issue a bit of a clue on Twitter later as well, but let's see if anyone gets it.
I'm sure somebody will. They're a smart bunch, our followers, aren't they?
They are.
Okay, well, we've had some big news this week, Syd. I keep thinking we're going to have a week where nothing happens, but it's not happened yet, so that's good. So on Wednesday, the ECB had another meeting, and they've decided that they're going to postpone the launch of the 100 by a year, so it will now be launched in 2021. Bit inevitable, Syd?
Yeah, probably in retrospect. The ECB have been talking a good game about playing as much domestic cricket as possible. But from as we can see, that there's obviously a debate within the ECB about whether or not the 100 will go ahead. There were obviously people already saying definitely that it needs to be postponed, and that's now what they've done. And this does allow them to focus on other things and to focus the ECB's efforts on getting some internationals for the television, which is obviously their aim now. There's been some stuff in the Telegraph over the last couple of days actually suggesting that the ECB are probably actually realise that there's going to be no domestic cricket whatsoever, and that's why they're just very focused on trying to play some internationals and get some cricket back on TV that we can watch and enjoy.
Yeah, it's a big call, but for what it's worth, I think it's probably the right one in terms of if you're going to launch a big new competition that's all about kind of trying to attract new people to come along and watch the sport, then you can't really do that behind closed doors and with half of your big name players not available. Yeah,
come and not watch the 100 wasn't a great marketing slogan.
I don't know if they trialled that one in their market research. Obviously, from the women's side of things, it's quite disappointing for a number of players. So there was a particular tweet of Katie Levick's, our friend Katie Levick's, which went kind of viral, viral as much as any women's cricket tweet does, basically reflecting on the fact that while a lot of people, or kind of traditional cricket fans, are celebrating the delay to the 100, actually, from the players' perspective, who were due to get some money from the women's 100, this could be potentially career-ending, actually, because are they really going to hang around for another year waiting for a paycheck?
Yeah, there's obviously a huge chunk of players that were depending on this to get something out of cricket this summer. Just like there were 40 players that were hoping, and some had pretty much expecting to be able to get to be paid to be part of the COEs, and that could still happen, obviously. But this does now look like there'll be potentially nothing for those, although we do understand that there are conversations ongoing with the PCA about stuff, so it's possible still that that there might be some better news for those players in terms of announcing that they're going to get some sort of recompense. Because we know that some of the men, or rather all the contracted men, have been paid part of their fee already. They were paid up front. The women weren't paid up front. So it would be really good if the ECB can find a way of channeling some money to those players who are otherwise going to get nothing for the year.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens. The other thing that's been kind of talked about as far as the men's 100 goes is the fact that some of the players who'd been drafted to some of the men's teams won't be available now next year. And actually, will they just completely redo the draft? And then the teams could end up looking quite different. What do we think about that as far as the women's goes? Because obviously the selection process was done quite differently for the women's. We didn't have a draft, and it was being done on an individual player by player negotiation basis, wasn't it? So what's the impact of this going to be, and in terms of how the women's squads look next year?
Well, I suppose one advantage of not having a draft is that you don't have to redo the draft. I would think that they will carry on approaching it quite informally. I think the squads will stay largely the same. They probably, won't be keen to move England players around. They were the only ones that were kind of allocated in order to make sure that there was some kind of balance. They weren't directly allocated, as in we'll tell you who goes here, but the ECB oversaw a process which ensured that there was a bit of a balance in terms of where England players went. We might see, obviously, that some international players might decide not to come in 2021 that were planning to come this year, but the system will just deal with that as it comes, I think. So I'd expect to see roughly the same sorts of sides, not least because the sides were tied to where people were largely. Apart from the big international stars, you mostly had Lancashire was mostly going to be made up of women that lived in Lancashire, and Yorkshire was mostly going to be made up of people who lived in Yorkshire and the North East, etc., etc.
Okay. So that's the big news about the 100. There was some other news this week emanating from down under, from Australia. Cricket Australia have announced their contracts, both men's and women's, and there's a little bit of upheaval in terms of the women's side of things. So Elise Villani and Nicole Bolton have both fallen off the list of centrally contracted players, but the additions are Taylor Lemick, Annabelle Sutherland, and Talia McGrath have all got their Cricket Australia central contracts, and that means that there's now one extra central contract as well, so 15 players this time around instead of 14. So what do you make of all that then, Sid? Were you surprised by any of that?
Not especially. I mean, Australia are desperate to try and find fast bowlers, aren't they? And it did make me think a little bit. I know that you mentioned when you were reading Cricket 2.0, the book that's been released recently about 2020 cricket, that they talk in that a little bit about how you can end up in men's cricket with a team consisting entirely of spinners, or a bowling attack consisting entirely of spinners. And it made me think about the way that the attacks are being built up by teams like Australia. They're going, well, we need to have X number of seamers, therefore we're going to bring in Talia McGrath because... And I do wonder if they're actually making a bit of a strategic mistake. At the end of the day, you're going to play, 99% of the cricket that you're going to play is going to be limited overs cricket. What actually matters is whether or not someone's going to concede runs and to a lesser extent even take wickets. So, if you're Amanda J. Wellingtons, they're going to take potentially more wickets and certainly concede less runs than your Talia McGrath, then you've got to question why those people are being left out. There's very much this attachment to the tradition of we play two fast bowlers, but I'm not sure that necessarily really works. But maybe I'm going to wind up eating my words, and Talia McGrath winds up, being the next Elise Perry. It could very well happen as well.
Certainly being mooted as such by Matthew Mott and the media. So best of luck to her and all the other contracted players. Obviously, it's a shame for Bolton and Villani, but then again, the Australia system is a lot better than ours. If you fall off the Cricket Australia centrally contracted players, you've got your state contract to go back to. So it's not really the same situation that somebody like Alex Hartley finds herself in. Yeah. And there's been another bit of news this week that's quite interesting, which relates to the decision that we talked about, maybe it was a couple of podcasts ago, about the ICC's decision to split the available points on offer between India and Pakistan for their unplayed championship series. So apparently the PCB, the Pakistan Cricket Board, are considering raising a dispute with the ICC committee that deals with such matters, and they are thinking about actually raising an official complaint about this and trying to get the decision overturned, as I understand it. So that would mean, so as it stands, India, because the points were split, India have qualified at the expense of Pakistan, so you can understand why Pakistan are a bit miffed. So that was a story reported on CRICKETher this week, so that'll be really interesting to see what happens there, won't it, Sid?
Potentially, yeah. I don't think they're going to get very far. The rules, might not have been fair, but they were reasonably clear. And at the end of the day, you're appealing at this stage to the same people that made the rules and made the ruling that's relevant. So I don't think that they're going to get very far.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see. We'll bring you discussions of that as it happens. And something that you mentioned earlier was about the ECB's renewed focus on trying to get some international cricket happening. So we maybe can talk a little bit about that as well, in terms of how it relates to the women's stuff. So initially, the idea is that what's actually being reported, that as early as July, England are going to be playing a test series, or England men, I should say, are going to be playing a test series against the West Indies. And so that seems very optimistic to me, in the sense of July only being about 8 weeks away. That's 8 weeks to draw up your plans to create a biosecure environment, get those plans approved by the government, then to actually bring about your biosecure environment practically, with all that that entails, and then to get all the players on board with it. That's not really very long when you think about everything that would have to be done in that space of time.
Yeah, it's not. When you put it like that, it's going to be a huge challenge. But there are lots of huge challenges out there, and we know that the ECB, along with people like the Football Association, are in talks with the government about how they can get their sports restarted. Carry on bringing forward the plans, and let's see what happens. We'd all like it to be the case that they're able to get some cricket played, and we'd obviously like to get some women's cricket in there as well. Everyone wants to see that, but everyone also wants to ensure the safety of everybody involved and everybody outside of cricket. So let's make sure that all those things happen together. Jared Kimber posted a really great video onto YouTube, onto his new YouTube channel this week, pointing out loads of the problems that there were associated with this. Things like the fact that you aren't talking about just 22 people and 2 umpires to get a cricket match on. You're talking about sort of 300 odd people for one of the big men's games. You might be able to get away with a few less for the women's games, but there's still a lot of people to try and get through there, and those things do concern me. But you had some conversations this week, didn't you, regarding who might be allowed to attend those games?
Well, we had the Cricket Writers Club AGM this week. Obviously, it was held virtually over Zoom. It worked really well. But one of the things that was discussed was they had a kind of spokesperson for the ECB talking about how a match that happens behind closed doors might impact on the media. And I can't remember if we talked about it on Vodcast, but we'd previously speculated, certainly amongst ourselves, that actually the media wouldn't be let into those games because, in a way, the written press's role is not vital to a cricket match taking place. And there's plenty of times at the moment when people report on women's matches just off the TV. And they just write their match reports from that. And so our kind of view was that would be how it would proceed, that if the match was on the TV, then we would, as written press, report from it like that. But the ECB appear to be saying that they're making preparations for some written press to be let in to these kind of sealed biosecure environments, and to be allowed to report from the ground. Now, obviously, things like press conferences, etc., there would have to be special arrangements made. And the idea, I think, is that the press would kind of sit in a sort of sealed off compartment and then would have to social distance between themselves within that. But I was quite surprised to hear that, actually, given the conversations that we'd had ourselves about that not being very likely.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to do down our own importance, but I'm not convinced that our presence there is absolutely essential. And I have to admit that I feel slightly uncomfortable about the idea of going to a game under those circumstances. It sort of feels like if you don't have to be there, it doesn't appear to be a necessary reason to, go out and start taking chances with your health and the health of everybody else around you. So I'm not completely sure that I'd feel comfortable with that, but let's see how we all feel in 2 months' time. I mean, it may be that in 2 months' time the situation has, radically changed, and that we've found much better ways of handling the virus. And even if we don't have a vaccine in 2 months' time, we could have much better ways of dealing with it, which mean it's nothing like as deadly, and we can all kind of go back to something much closer to normal life. But until that happens, I probably think that I really ought to kind of stick away from any situation that I don't have to be in.
Well, we're in quite a luxurious position in terms of not being reliant on our freelance journalism income to support ourselves. Obviously, there are plenty of writers out there who will be very, very keen to be able to get to matches because that's their income. So I think that was one of the reasons for trying to address the Cricket Writers Club AGM in that way and try and reassure people. So in a way, we've got the luxury of, I guess, not having to report on matches if we deem it to not be necessary, whereas obviously plenty of other people don't have that luxury. So. But yeah, it's just interesting to reflect on what a biosecure environment match might look like. And I guess that potentially if this men's test tour goes ahead, then that will be a bit of, from our perspective, a little bit of a test for whether they can get some women's internationals on a little bit later in the year as well.
Yeah, well, now that women's cricket has equal importance to the men, then, I'm looking forward to those 5-day women's tests that we're going to be playing.
Sounds good.
Right, Colin?
Okay, Sid. And finally this week, there may not be any actual women's county cricket happening at the moment, but we have heard rumours of something exciting stirring in cyberspace, haven't we, Sid?
We have, so there'll be more announcements about that later this week. A little bit of competition between counties. So, watch this cyberspace.
He's been waiting to make that joke for about 48 hours. Okay, thanks guys. Until next time, take care and we'll see you next week.